You're also a former chairwoman of the Tribal Council and business manager for the Nisqually to this day. And thank you, Cynthia, so much for joining us and sharing today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information about Chief Leschi and the Nisqually people and his brother Quiyamoots. This is such a great piece of history that I'm really happy that so many people are interested in. It's a point in time that constitutes the relationship between our Nisqually people and other tribes, along with all of our non-tribal neighbors that we currently have. So I'm just really honored to be able to share this with you today. If you would like, then I'm going to go ahead and try to share my slideshow and get started. Is that good?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. I'm a little new to Zoom, but let's see here. One participant at a time can share. Okay, so we're going to share that. And let me see. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yes, that's great. Yes.
It's that you can. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Again, my name is Cynthia Iyall, and I'm a Nisqually elder now. I've worked for the tribe for 25 years in a variety of positions, mostly in economic development and planning. I'm currently an administrator, and I was fortunate enough to be able to serve on tribal council for 12 years, and 9 of those years as tribal chairwoman. So I've been able to see a lot of things and get to know so many people and families, and it's just been a great opportunity career-wise to be able to embrace this part of our history and learn as much as I possibly can about it. And again, thank you for all your patience today and listening to this piece of our history. I am more than happy to answer questions. I think we're going to have a question and answer period after the slideshow. So I'll be happy to do that for you. Let's see. Now I'm just trying to. Okay. Sorry, I was able to forward the slide last time very easily. There we go. All right, I think I've got it. All right, so our name is Nisqually, which is what we say in the present day. Our original name in our language, in our Leschi language, was Nisqually Ach, people of the river and people of the grass country. And way back when, before we had any kind of development here at Nisqually, this place was known to be one of the most rich in resources of areas around the nation, and people could live here and live here well. We're going to take a look at some of these resources that made this area so unique and plentiful. Some of you may have heard about our geoduck. Our geoduck only grows on the west coast over here from about Washington to Alaska. And this is one of the resources that even back before all of the development, back in the early 1800s and before, people would be able to go out to the banks of the beach and wait till that tide went out and would go out and harvest geoduck. We also were known for our resources in terms of finfish, and salmon were known to be so thick across the river that people could walk on the backs of the salmon to get to the other side. That's really not the case today, but this was known for an incredible area for finfish. This is one of my favorite resources. That's the camas when it's in bloom. The camas plant is a history in itself. There's so much about the families as they would gather to harvest this beautiful plant, and the core of it, the root of it that they would dig up would be able to be steamed or cooked and kept for the entire winter. The camas bulb was a large part of our diet. This is a picture of some berries, and there were all types of berries here in the Northwest region that allowed us to dry and keep for the whole winter. We had all kinds of game, bear, elk, all types of animals that could be harvested for the families and kept throughout the winter. This picture is of some cedar trees, and probably a lot of you know how important the cedar tree is to the Nisqually people. One of my favorite things that Cynthia Carpenter had told me was that the cedar trees love to be near the river. And that was because that kept them growing so well. And they just loved to dangle their toes or their roots in the water. So they grew really well near the rivers and lakes. One of our resources also that people don't always know about or talk about were our prairies. Our prairies, of course, were full of beautiful medicines and different types of plants, but that was also the area that Leschi and his brother Queamboots raised their horses. And horses first came to Nisqually when Leschi's parents, Yanotko of Nisqually, and his mother Cornuzita, who was Klickitat, when they married, she came here to live with Yanotko, as was the typical way of Nisqually people. The woman would come and live with her new husband, and she brought with her a dowry of 50 horses. And that's when Nisqually became horse people. So Leschi and his brother Queamboots grew up being tremendous horsemen. And there's a picture of horses grazing along the prairie. Today, we're working really hard on bringing back this horse culture. It's so important in terms of Leschi and his history. And just a year ago, we were able to purchase a ranch, and we have about a half a dozen young men, Nisqually men, that are all working there as ranch hands, and they're taking care of a herd of horses. And we are getting equine assisted therapy up and running as a program for socialization and therapy for youth and elders. So it's really exciting to bring this part of our history back. And I think it's a great nod to Chief Leschi, how much we appreciate his history. This is one of my favorite slides because the wording came from Cynthia Carpenter in one of her books called Leschi, the Last Chief of the Nisquallies. And this is a drawing of him. He was born in 1808. And of course, he was hung in February 19th, 1858. So this is a really good time of year to bring these kinds of discussions up because it falls right around an important time noting the life of Leschi. This slide says, Leschi was known as a man of great intelligence with superb oratorical abilities. His wisdom was often sought by his tribesmen to settle disagreements, so he was known as a judge. His father was Nisqually, and that was Yanotko, and his mother, Cornuzita, was Klickitat, or from Yakima. This mixed heritage provided him with a tall, agile body and strong, heavy shoulders. It was said that most distinguishing features he had was his alert, penetrating eyes. And I've read that in many different parts of our history, was that he was known for those eyes. Leschi was a man who made great impressions on many different people. And during this time frame that we're going to be talking about, he was known all through the land. People either loved him or they hated him, but he was known. He really was significant during a time where that was just so different than how we are today. And we'll talk about that too. Here's just a brief map showing basically where Nisqually tribe is today. The tribe is, of course, has existed for thousands of years here in the Northwest. Today, our Nisqually Reservation is located along the Nisqually River here in Thurston County, about 15 miles east of the capital, Olympia. And here's another map that just shows a little more in a larger area how close we are to the waterways. The Nisqually watershed is talked about in the news quite a bit. We have a great natural resources department that does tremendous work restoring native plants and keeping the entire watershed clean. There's huge efforts there to keep this land as pristine as possible. Before, or going back a ways, we take a look at this map where it was the Washington Territory. And on March 2nd of 1853, the United States Congress officially declared the Washington Territory separate from the Oregon Territory. And in addition, Isaac I. Stevens is appointed as the very first territorial governor. He is also appointed at that same time as the first superintendent of Indian Affairs here in the Washington Territory. So he comes out with two roles. Stevens is charged with securing land for the United States government by making treaties with Native people who have lived in this area for thousands of years. We're going to talk quite a bit today about Governor Stevens. When Governor Stevens came out here, he had a bit of a political background, and he was looking for ways that he can be noticed and make his career look good. He had many high aspirations for his career. When this opportunity for him came up, he came out with the intent of doing a great job, making an impression, and getting back to the Washington, D.C. area and hopefully getting a higher position. When he came out, there were 5 treaty districts that were set up. And Governor Stevens just basically took the Washington Territory and drew it into 5 separate areas. He arranged for the headsmen of each of the different tribes to act as the tribal representative, completely ignoring whoever we had in charge at that point in time. He was making his decision as to who he was going to be talking with and negotiating with. He offered schools, hospitals, blacksmith shops, hunting and gathering and fishing rights, as well as some land to live on. So when Stevens comes out this way, he is tunnel vision into this map and getting these 5 treaties done and completed so he can move back to his career and get on with his life, basically. There's a few books that are out there that talk about Governor Stevens. And there's one in particular that I believe the title is Isaac Stevens, Young Man on a Mission, or something of that nature. But he was known for coming out and having tunnel vision, and that is important to know as we go through this story. Let's see here. Oh, what happened to my... Okay, sorry.
If you'd like, Cynthia, you can exit the screen and share and then come back in.
Okay.
That's that slideshow button first on your way in.
Maybe I need to do that. Sorry, folks. Okay. Okay, let's try that. Oh, okay. I must have pressed something. Let's see. I'm going to try that one more time. Stop share. Okay, well, I'm not sure what I did there. Let's see.
Maybe just leave that the whole program up, and we'll see that screen with you.
There we go. Okay. All right. So we have 5 areas, 5 different treaties that are going to be negotiated within the Washington Territory. We have a new governor, Governor Isaac Stevens, and he has a second role, and that is also to be the superintendent of Indian Affairs here in the Northwest. This map shows the locations of each of the reservations that were predetermined at the discretion of this treaty commission. This is an older photo and it's of the treaty area of Medicine Creek. And this was the first treaty assembled by Stevens that was organized. And if you're familiar with the refuge, it's now called the Billy Frank Nisqually Wildlife Refuge. There used to be an old snake of an old fir tree, and I think that came down in the early 2000s. But that old tree was right along I-5. That is where the negotiation happened. And the treaty was explained to the Nisquallys, Puyallups, Squaxins, and other tribes in English. And that is really important to know because Leschi never spoke English. He spoke his own language, as did the other tribal warriors that were there, and his brother Queemoots, but he was never known to speak English. He was known to use a part of the Chinook language that was a trade language. And he had even made arrangements for one of their cousins to come from the Southern Oregon area to come up and help connect the language as they were negotiating this treaty. This is a photo, it's an old photo of a Nisqually fishing weir. And as you can see, it goes along the entire river and it helps with the harvesting of fish. An important thing to know is that as a part of this proposed agreement, Muck Creek, which is shown here in the photo, would not be available to the Nisquallys in this Medicine Creek Treaty. It is said that Leschi refused to sign that treaty, yet an X was placed right next to his name. And some of the stories that I've been told was that one of the officers that was there with Stevens that day was so frustrated that Leschi and Queemoots would not sign that he went ahead and put that X down for them. It was also known that when they went to this treaty negotiation, that Leschi and his brother Queemoots were there, even though they couldn't speak the language, and everything was being presented to them in English. I mean, talk about just a major conflict right there. That's certainly not a true negotiation. That's a one-sided, here's what we're going to do and you're going to come along. Stevens had this mentality, again, the tunnel vision coming out here. He had things on his mind that he wanted to get done. His number one job was to get all 5 of these treaties done and signed. And then he wanted to help bring out the railroad system to bring economy and bring people out and start getting this land transformed into cities and so forth.
That's an image from over.
Yes. So anyway, one of the most important pieces about this and why Leschi and Queemoots, once they started to figure out what was going on, and if you can imagine, that treaty was negotiated December 24th, how rainy it gets here. And it's noted in several of the journals of the soldiers that were there at that time that it was the time of ceaseless rains. You know how foggy it is, how difficult it is. They had a few chairs and tables set up around this fir tree. That was for Stevens and his staff, as well as his son Hazard, who was about 12 years old at that time, and Leschi, Queemoots, and the other warriors who were brought up to negotiate this treaty. So they had this core group of people listening to what was going on. And through all of this chaos and disorganization, Leschi and Queemoots were able to figure out that this was not going to allow them to live. If they were taken away from their resources, and the fish in particular, they would not survive. They had to be on the river. And if we go back to our name, Squaliopch, people of the river, people of the grass country, that's how we had thrived for so many years. So that's a key piece to know, is that Muck Creek was not included in that first reservation. As soon as that negotiation was done and signed off on by the people that were in attendance, minus Leschi and Queemoots, Stevens got onto his horse and they went on to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th treaty districts to complete those. He left Charles Mason, who was secretary, as acting governor while he was out on the trail. Here's a drawing of Charles Mason. Early in 1855, Leschi met with acting Governor Charles Mason to tell him that the Nisquallies wanted peace because we were a peaceful people. That was us naturally. But we needed to stay by the mouth of the Nisqually River where they could fish as well as farm. So Leschi went out of his way to talk to those who could make a difference, and was not given any consideration at all. When he wasn't given any consideration, and with Stevens out and on the trail and taking care of the other treaty districts, things got very heated and out of control. There were a lot of farmers and settlers in the area at that time, and they were making homes. They were putting up fences to keep their cattle in. They were farming. And when they did that, that meant the young Nisquallies and other tribal warriors that were used to being able to go from Green River down to White River for hunting and fishing and gathering and all of those things that we had done for thousands of years, all of a sudden, it could not be done anymore. And they weren't allowed to cross through some of these fences. They weren't allowed to cross over people's new land claims that used to be theirs. This is a picture of the Washington militia. And in fear that some of the Indians would resist this treaty, Stevens secured territorial legislative approval to form a volunteer militia. So these people that were worried about their new land claims and putting up their farms and their new homes, they were brought in to create this militia. These were not trained military people. They were farmers, they were blacksmiths and people of other trades. They were not trained in any type of military tactics, yet they were pulled together to act in that way. I put a definition of militia, which is a military force that is raised from the civil population to supplement a regular army in an emergency. So Stevens thought this was an emergency because Leschi resisted, because Quayamuth resisted. This is a photo of General John E. Wool, and he was general of the regular army. He sharply criticized the action that Stevens took in getting the militia. And he believed the Nisquallies, who he knew of and communicated with, and he knew that they had always lived in peace. He thought that the Nisquallies were starting to turn hostile because of Stevens' premature organization of this volunteer militia. And I think that that's true as well. This militia was starting to act as though they were military, and they weren't trained in such tactics. So they were acting, I think, far out of the scope of what a regular army would, and creating a really hostile environment. We also know that many of the young warriors from Nisqually and the other tribes would take it upon themselves to try to go out and hunt and gather where they could and take their families where they needed to go get food and be able to continue to live peacefully. But that was a conflict. And now all of a sudden the Nisquallies and the families of Medicine Creek were being left without the valuable resources that they really needed to maintain their life. Here's a drawing, and I believe this is the only one, of Quayamuth, which is Leschi's brother or half-brother. By October 1855, acting Governor Mason, and remember Mason was here in Olympia while Stevens was out on the trail, he was here in charge, right? So by October, Mason ordered Eaton's Rangers, a detachment of the militia, to bring Leschi and his brother Quayamuth into custody. And he did that because he was very afraid of Leschi and Quayamuth. How dare Leschi come into town and ask him to try and rework this treaty so that the Nisquallies stayed on the mouth of the river? That was what they wanted. They were trying to keep their future generations alive. And they knew that this treaty that was proposed that kept them away from the river and had them way up high on Johnson's Point in a wooded, rocky area would not allow them to fish and would not allow them to farm. It was not conducive for that lifestyle at all. So they knew that was a death sentence. So Leschi and Queemuth were the ones who went out there and tried to communicate that, even though there was a barrier of language. But they risked their life. They came into town and they offered to do this peacefully. They just needed to change that reservation to somewhere along the Nisqually River, preferably right there at the mouth. That was all they were asking, yet they didn't get any kind of consideration for that at all. That was a pivotal moment right there. One person, either Mason or Stevens, had they just listened to that request and acted on it, it could have been a completely different story. This is a photo of Connell's Prairie. Those of you here in the area may know where this is. Leschi and Queemuth ended up fleeing northeast toward the White River, heading over the Natchez Pass to escape the militia. The militia was hard after them because Charles Mason put out the word that they are hostile Indians and they must be brought in. So heading over the Natchez Pass to escape the militia is where they were going. Meanwhile, other bands of warriors aided Leschi's escape, and they ambushed the pursuing Eaton's Rangers at Connell's Prairie, killing 2 men. As a result of these actions, warriors gathered from all over the region, and Leschi's instructions were very, very clear to all. He said, the war is with the troops and not the settlers. And nevertheless, a renegade war party looted and burned the homes of 3 white families, killing 9 people who had settled on the White River. Then, on October 31st, 1855, a 7-man militia commanded by Captain Maurice Maloney passed through an Indian encampment. A mile down the trail, they were ambushed, and a volunteer colonel, A.B. Moses, was shot and killed. When Captain Maloney's main forces reached the same Indian encampment days later, a fierce 3-day battle ensued. This is known as the Puget Sound Indian War. And there wasn't a lot of battles. There was more of just kind of bumping into each other along the trail. But these are the highlights of some of the devastating destruction that happened that has not ever been forgotten. The killing of A.B. Moses during this moment of war was something that Leschi will end up paying with his life about. Now, Isaac Stevens, our governor and superintendent over all the tribal issues, he heard of the Green River battle, and he gave a speech to the territorial legislature promising the eradication of hostile Indians. He said those words. That is a quote. He says it openly right there, that is the plan, is to get rid of the Indians. This is the book. Oh, and I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong words earlier, but this is the book that I was talking about. It's by Kent Richards, and it's Isaac Stevens, A Young Man in a Hurry. It's an interesting read, and it gives you a little bit more insight about this man. Stevens, who is known as being a very short man, and it kind of shows in this photo, and he was often photographed sitting, people believe, because he was self-conscious about his height. He had a military background. He had military schooling and was very much on a career path. He had brought his wife and his 12-year-old son, Hazard, out here to the Northwest with him. They were here and they were society people, his wife in particular. So for him to be out on the trail and have his wife here in Olympia, which, if you can imagine at that time, was basically a large building, was Olympia. And that was the hotel, it was the restaurant, and it was the place of gathering, the governor's office, and everything all in one. And that's where she was staying. Her and her son were in a room upstairs. And being a society person and then being stationed here for a time being, muddy roads, no parties, no social events, it must have been just really tremendously hard on her, which I'm sure made it hard on him as well. But This is just a little bit of an insight on Stevens. So he comes here, wife and family, thinking it's going to be a short trip, thinking it's going to be an easy trip. Let's just carve out these 5 treaties, districts. Let's get those done. Let's open the path for railroad, and we'll get back to DC and we'll move on for the next appointment. But little did he realize that ignoring the Indians, that ignoring our way of life here at that time and taking away access to all of our resources was just something that Chief Leschi and his brother Queenwoods could not have. And they went to become known as the people who really took the time to put themselves out there as a martyr, basically. There were many other tribal leaders at that time who saw what was happening, and they fled north. They fled up to Canada. But Leschi was here. He believed in this area. It was so rich. It was so full of resources. And he wanted his future generations to be able to have that same lifestyle that he had. In early January of 1856, Leschi again reached out to the government and attempted to make peace while asking for a reasonable land base for his people. He was known to have canoed into what we know as Port of Olympia, and he canoed in. Acting Governor Mason at that time was there and came out to the beach. Leschi in his canoe is hollering at him, "I will cut off my left hand if you will just keep the peace with our Nisqually people and allow us to live on the mouth of the river. We need that." And again, he wasn't even answered. It was a fruitless attempt. So all this time, even though Leschi was focused on the war and the battle was really with the soldiers and not the people, in his mind, there was one thing to do, and that was to get the Nisqually people on the river to maintain their lifestyle for that generation and many generations to come. He had known, and even though it was like territory at that time, and there were no cell phones, there was no TV and no radio. Now we get information from around the world instantly on our phones. But if you can imagine back then, they had a very organized way of communicating, and he knew what was going on. For about 100 years beforehand, it started on the East Coast with the British coming in and taking land, and the rules that they had, thinking that if they discovered the land, that it belonged to the British king, and that happened all the way across the nation. And we were at the tail end of that, and our treaties were the very end of that way of thinking. But all along that way, there was all kinds of federal law that had been created that was not good law for the Indian people across the nation. But Stevens knew his cousins, especially Kamaikan from Yakima, Chief Joseph from Nez Perce, all of his cousins had communicated that there are more white people coming than there are rocks in the ground. So Leschi knew that they were far, far outnumbered. He maintained a peaceful way of doing this. And he maintained and he stayed to ensure, with the cost of it being his own life, that Nisqually people had the river to continue being people of the river and people of the grass country. Governor Stevens and the Indian War Council. So he refused and maintained that all hostiles must be put in jail and stand trial. So Leschi's attempt for peace again, refused by Stevens, and now he needs to go to jail for that because he's hostile. However, the Indian War Council disagreed with this. Stevens gave orders to Militia Captain Maxson: all Indians found in your field of operations, except those mounted, who are allied Indians of the government, they are to be considered enemies. Leschi's orders to make war on the troops and not the settlers was stringently obeyed by the Nisqually people. Nisqually people didn't have a sitting chief. They chose leaders or chiefs at the time of need. And through ceremony and much discussion and just knowing the great oratorical abilities that Chief Leschi had, and being a judge for all of their disagreements and so forth, made him a leader that was needed for this time. And he was a very good leader. He did not give up. He did not flee. He tried for peace, and he kept that same message. Nisqually people need to be on that Nisqually River. Even through all of this, though, and his own people were obeying him strongly, Stevens is further outraged by all of this because a group of influential white settlers who were married to Indian women who refused to leave their land claims for the militia blockhouses. And you may recognize some of the names like Couts and Longmire and Tolmie. There were several influential white settlers who were able to live with the Nisquallys, and they were grateful to the Nisquallys because Leschi and others had shown them some beautiful, rich areas where they could live, farm, and live safely and peacefully. And they were grateful for that. And they just didn't see Leschi or the Nisqually people as hostile Indians who needed to be eradicated. So Stevens had those who were against him, and I think that built his frustration and just made his tunnel vision even more stubborn. The Michelle massacre, you've probably heard about that if you've listened to anything about the Leschi story. This was a really devastating time for Nisquallys. In April 1856, during the Indian Wars, Captain Hamilton Maxon and his citizen militia come upon a Nisqually encampment near the Ohop Creek and the Michelle River joined together. This is right at the end of Thurston County. Several families, mostly women and children, were camped there. Captain Maxon and his volunteers kill everyone in that camp. And they're found a larger encampment near the confluence of the two rivers, again with mostly women and children present. The troops killed all of these people, women and children alike, and they were non-combatant. And then they wound many more. This was known as the Michelle massacre. There's a book out there written by one of the Eatonville school teachers, and I'm sorry her name escapes me at the moment, but they recognize what had happened, and that is a part of this history. This time is so hostile. There's not a lot of communication. There's no cell phones, TVs, radios, but there's word of mouth, and word of mouth gets out there quickly. And there's also a newspaper. It's called The Truth Teller. And that's really the biggest form of communication. The Nisquallys had a very organized way of communicating. We had runners from certain families that would run from one camp to another and pass on messages that needed to be communicated. So everyone up and down the river, and we had 13 large camps up and down the Nisqually River, knew what was going on and when they needed to prepare for something or whatever might be coming. That was also true from tribe to tribe. So we had runners who would go from Nisqually to some of the other Medicine Creek tribes, or up to Yakima, or even Nez Perce. It was a very organized way of communicating. But even at this time, whether you were an Indian person, whether you were a settler, a non-tribal, you knew who Leschi was. You either loved him or you hated him, but everybody knew who he was. His name was everywhere. On April 3rd, 1856, right after the Michelle massacre, Stevens declared martial law. It had gotten so out of hand. Stevens believes he has the legal right to relieve the civil courts of their jurisdiction by suspending the civil practice of trial by jury. That says a lot about that person. That really says a lot about how he sees his role and how he sees himself. Stevens believed local juries would not levy adequate punishment against the many settlers supporting Leschi's position. This guy must be nervous, and he must be quite scared. And rightly so. He's not doing well. He's not making good decisions. He's got the entire Washington Territory in an uproar. So with all of these things that he had done, he receives a reprimand. And I believe that is President Pierce. Stevens' actions later resulted in a congressional investigation and reprimand from the President of the United States. So that's going to impact his career, making him probably even madder the entire way he goes along through his plan here of coming in, getting 5 treaties done, and bringing in the railroad. His plans are not going smoothly. General Wool over the regular army disagrees with Stevens. He sharply disagrees with Stevens and believes the regular army troops in the district were more than sufficient to handle whatever emergency might arise. And that would have been so good if it was just the regular army who did handle it, because they were trained in military tactics. They were trained in this area as well. They knew their way. They knew how to work with Leschi and other tribes in getting around and having scouts work with them. In fact, General Wool was of the opinion that the troubles were caused by some of the individual members of the militia who were untrained and undisciplined. And you can see that happening. Some of the settlers that come in are probably farmers, no military background, and they're probably scared coming into this area, especially wintertime. The days are short, the rain, it's muddy everywhere. They don't know where they are. They don't know the territory well. And it's been said that at the Nisqually Reservation, part of the reservation is way up high, and it just kind of, the bank of the river just drops way down like 500 feet. And it's been said, and we've found evidence of camps where Leschi and Quaaludes were sitting way up high on the bluff, and they were just watching down below the militia guys who were hacking their way through the brush and the trees, trying to find their way around. And they were so loud that they could be heard. And they were just incredibly disorganized. Stevens, under pressure from the president now, because he's been reprimanded, he agrees to change the location of the Puyallup and Nisqually reservations. The Nisqually reservation now finally includes parts of Muck Creek that is just so critical to the Nisqually people. And Stevens again placed all blame on Leschi for the conflict and stated that he agreed to change the treaty land prior to any conflict, ignoring Leschi's numerous attempts to make peace. So now he's backtracking. William Tolmie, Dr. Tolmie, with the knowledge of a price on his head, Leschi returned home. Remember, he was trying to escape the militia. He returned home and went to his very trusted friend, Dr. Tolmie. And if you're not familiar with him, he was a real prominent settler at that time, and we do have a park named after him. He was the chief factor of Fort Nisqually for the Hudson Bay Company, and he asked Dr. Tolmie to negotiate with the Americans. Stevens refused again to negotiate. He considered Leschi a criminal and intended to charge him with the murder of A.B. Moses. He was the militia soldier who was killed on the Colonel Prairie more than a year before this. Colonel George Wright here, prior to returning, Leschi had remained east of the Cascades under the protection of Colonel George Wright, commander of the federal forces east of the Cascades. And he says, the assurances I gave to all the chiefs who submitted, including Leschi, were full and complete, so far as the military authorities were concerned as to their personal safety. Under all the circumstances of the case, I sincerely hope that Leschi will not made to be suffered death. I most earnestly pray that the pardoning power may be interposed and Leschi saved from the gallows. That's a pretty powerful statement coming from a general or a colonel. However, on November 13th, 1856, Leschi was captured and he was imprisoned at Fort Steilacoom under the custody of Colonel Casey. Trial testimony. So Rabison knew Leschi by sight. He only knew him by sight and not by name. During this testimony, the distance from victim at the time of shooting was unclear, and there was conflicting testimony. Smoke from guns obscured the view. Leschi was not identified as the man who fired the fatal shot. There was no evidence at that trial that Leschi was the person who killed A.B. Moses. Leschi claims that he wasn't there and clearly denies shooting Moses. This trial ends in a hung jury. Ezra Meeker, who is in this photo, and he's also a very well-known and held in high esteem settler. Ezra Meeker is one of the jurors, and his vote is one of two that says not guilty. The U.S. Army has a position as well that acts of violence during a time of war should not result in either side being held personally accountable. I think for all of us, for most of us, that is common sense. However, we have a new jury, and this new jury comes with new instructions. Pierce County is the jury. The jury in the first trial was instructed to consider the active war circumstance that we just talked about. Now, new jury in Thurston County, the second trial, this jury is told not to consider the active war circumstance. So a big difference there. The verdict in Olympia on March 18, 1857 is that Leschi was found guilty and sentenced to hang. There are delays due to the appeals in the territorial Supreme Court schedules, and Leschi is scheduled for execution in June. So that is several months. Now, he's already spent a lengthy time in jail. And this is a man who lived off the land, who lived a very healthy life with a mainstay diet of camas and fish and berries and healthy foods. And now he's been imprisoned for a lengthy period of time, and who knows what he's actually fed. But we do know that he was very homesick for his family. He was a family man, and we know that he was just sick physically from being stuck imprisoned. This is a photo of Lieutenant August Counts, and we have many Counts family members still within the Nisqually tribe today. He is quoted as saying, "A survey of the ground in the vicinity of where Moses was killed has been made by a highly intelligent and competitive gentleman, Lieutenant A.V. Counts of the U.S. Army." Now, during these trials, there was a really important map, and it was created by Lieutenant Counts. And here's the map. This shows the area where A.B. Moses was killed. It also shows the route that Leschi took, which is in red, and the route that the militia took, which is in blue. And it also shows the first meeting of those two. It is measured in chains, which is the method of measurement for that time. And it shows that there was no way that Leschi could have been at that same place where the militia was, where A.B. Moses was killed. He makes that point, and he proves that. And that was a piece of evidence that was brought into that first trial, but was not allowed in that second trial. And you've got to believe that Stevens had a major part in making sure that these things were not presented, because he was looking bad himself, but he was going to make sure that this was all blamed on Leschi, and that Leschi became the scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong. So Leschi was executed. Stevens directed the erection of a scaffold a mile east of Fort Steilacoom, and that's where this was held. Leschi's family and people were there. He told them to be peaceful, and that he accepted what was happening. This was like a natural bowl in the ground. So the scaffold where they were doing this was right in the center of that bowl, and people would kind of gather around the ring of that and watch. And his tribesmen were there to support him. as he said his last words. And his last words were very poignant, and said that he wanted everyone to know what had happened there at that time, here in this Washington territory, here with all the Nisqually people and all the new people coming into our territory. And he wanted us to tell this story to our grandchildren and their grandchildren and their grandchildren and so on. So thank you again for listening to this story today. That's what happened to Chief Leschi. His brother Quaamoots was also killed during this time. He was very concerned about his brother when he was imprisoned, and turned himself in, and his friend James Longmire rode in with him, and Quaamoots turned himself in late at night to the governor. The governor had already gone to bed and was asleep. His staff had told him Quaamoots is here, and he said, place him down in the office downstairs and lock him in, and I will talk to him in the morning. Quaamoots was put in an office, and that office was locked. So he sat down in the corner, leaned against the wall, and put his head over his arms and over his knees to sleep. Somehow someone was able to get into that office quietly enough. They were able to unlock it and walk in, and they stabbed him and ran. He got up and he ran out after the person who had just stabbed him, and he fell to his death right on the porch. No one was ever held accountable for that murder of Quaamoots right there in the governor's office in Olympia. There was someone who was detained by the sheriff at that time, and it is noted in many of the history books that that sheriff was an old drunk. And that person who was held for a short period of time was released an hour or so later, and nothing was ever came of that. So the Nisqually people just lost their leaders, Leschi, who they had named as chief to help get them through this transition of treaty time, and his beloved brother Quaamoots. So this story happened. Leschi is hung, Quaamoots is gone. Many of the families were gone in the Michelle massacre, and many other of the horrible things that had happened. The Nisqually people had gone from thousands of people down to very few, and it became a real dormant time for the Nisqually people. The treaty was negotiated that December. It was ratified by Congress, and that's it. Medicine Creek Treaty. That's the law of the land today. However, the Nisqually people went onto the reservation, which is included Muck Creek, and it was very quiet for a long, long period of time. But 100 years later, somehow, Leschi was known to be born under a very special star, and a lot of people, including Cecilia Carpenter, would talk about, his that star must have come out again, and it just brought this amazing time where Leschi's family, Larry Seaberg, Warren, and all of the family members of Leschi came out and joined forces with the historical community, with all of the tribes, with the legal community. And in 2004, in December 5th, a historical court of justice, which was led by State Supreme Court Chief Justice Gary Alexander, exonerated Chief Leschi, saying that he should never have been charged with murder because he acted as a lawful combatant in war. This Washington State Senate unanimously approved Senate Resolution 8727, which recognizes that an injustice was committed against Chief Leschi, and when he was convicted and executed in 1858. And here's just a couple of the news headlines that came out after that exoneration. But that exoneration, it was not a give me kind of situation. It was the third trial, and it was nerve-wracking to bring this up again, which we knew had to be done. But it was very difficult to do because we had to prove the injustice that was done in 1858. And Cecilia had all of the resources. Historically, she had done so much research that the documents were all in place. And she was so important in pulling this together. We had expert testimony that included family members and Cecilia Carpenter, and very, very importantly, 2 young men from Fort Lewis or JBLM. And they were historical, very knowledgeable about war and historical issues with JBLM. And they testified that that the whole lawful combatant issue during a time of war should stand. And so I really believe that that was the pinnacle piece of information. In addition to the 3rd trial allowed Lieutenant Kautz's map and all of that mountain of evidence that was never allowed in that 2nd trial, that was all brought forward and it was all considered. So all of the research, thank goodness, we had all of those documents and could share that, but it had to be brought forward in an official court, this historical court. And Justice Gary Alexander was very cautious not to be disrespectful to his ancestors, but to show that this is an additional chapter to this story of Chief Leschi and Medicine Creek. So we didn't change the story. We're adding to it this important piece of information that there was a wrongdoing. It was recognized later that there was a wrongdoing. And we recognize that this was a really violent time and a difficult time for Washington Territory. And we're adding this chapter so that people can get rest for what happened and we can move forward with that bit of truth and share this story. So now we remember Chief Leschi. You know, his name is all over the place. Leschi Park up in Seattle, Leschi Bakery, Leschi Grocery, all throughout Pierce County, and of course all throughout our area too. The tribes, everybody remembers Chief Leschi and how important he was. And thank goodness he was just so rooted here in our area that he stayed in and fought for the future generations. Today, our Nisqually tribe is close to 900 members, and we had gotten way down to less than about 100 members during a certain time period between treaty time and now. But the culture is going strong. We're an economic driver in our region now. We are one of the strongest stewards of the Nisqually watershed and environment, and we do take care of our history and our stories, and want to share that with you. Just a few pictures there of some of the cultural activities. We support our people with our government, which is growing and stronger all of the time. We have a new health clinic that was just opened this last year. We're under construction with a really amazing new elders facility. We have a horse ranch now facility that is there for therapy for our people, and it's also highlighting our horse culture. Many of our elders talk about horses as they were a part of our life. They were a part of our family, and everyone had a horse. We have a new administration building, new public safety building, you know, within the last 10 years, new roads. We just opened a wellness court. I was happy to be the administrator and help get that going this last 6 months. New educational programs, and we have record number of college graduates now, which is really fantastic. We support our economy, and if you're driving through Nisqually, you'll see at the roundabout that we're building our new store. We will be closing down the one that is on the other side of the highway. That was kind of limited in services. It was just mainly gas, I think, and pop there. But we continue to grow and move forward so that we can support our government and our people. We always continue to take part in any activities that supports our environment and supports keeping our natural resources in place the best that we can. For building our future, Leschi is an emblematic person of our tribe. He's one of our historical icons. We want to always be remembered for Leschi and our past. but also for the contributions that we make to the full community today, as well as our commitment to work together to build tomorrow. So we never forget this piece of our past. Had it not been for Leschi and for his brother Queemoots and for their tenacity in making sure that Medicine Creek Treaty included Muck Creek so we could thrive and continue on, we'll never forget that. That's why we're here today. All right, so that is it for my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions. And
I should mention to everybody that we did also have a phone call today from Gary Alexander, who wishes you well, Cynthia. They're unable to join the conversation today. He's very much wants to stay in touch with the Leschi family. And maybe you could say a word, Cynthia, about Gary's involvement in the historic court.
Sure. You know, it took a few years of people coming together and talking about how this could happen. And this whole thing actually started with Sherman Leschi, my uncle, who I'd go and visit him usually on a Sunday, take him some books, and we would exchange books and bring him some berries or some firewood and just sit and visit with him for a little while. And there was one weekend where he said, "I've got a project for you." And that is, we need to clear Leschi's name. And when he said that, I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. That was quite some time ago now. But, you know, I went and talked to Cecilia, talked to other family members, and the conversation just started rolling. And then there was some of the group from our historical friends who were at lunch one day in Tacoma, and they were talking about this. And somebody from the next table, which was at that time Pierce County Executive Director John Ladenburg, overheard the conversation, and he said, you know, we need to talk, we need to get involved, because Pierce County condemned a part of our reservation in the 1921 condemnation after Medicine Creek Treaty. And so he had a big interest in our history, and he knew quite a bit about Chief Leschi. And of course, every attorney, anyone who studies law here in Washington State, the case of Leschi and being guilty of murder is the very first case on the books of Washington State. And every law student studies that case. So everyone is familiar with it who's in the law community. But when Chief Gary Alexander came into the picture, which he came in through John Landberg, he was so good. He invited us into an office space. So Cecilia, myself, and a few others went in and would talk to him. And he brought up, oh, maybe we should pardon. We can do a pardon, I think. And, or talked about having a pardon. And from the way I remember it, Cecilia was, no, absolutely not. She was ready to pack up her books and walk out. She said, this is an attempt for an exoneration and nothing else. And, you know, he could have just shut everything down right at that moment. But he was so great. He listened to what the needs were. He listened to the details of the evidence and listened to really important pieces of this case. And then he took this and showed such great leadership all the way through the historical court, and just became such a well-respected person in Indian country, as far as being so fair and being so respectful of his own ancestors, yet doing what was very much needed, and that was adding this chapter.
Yes, well, thank you for bringing that to the fore again. And I should go back to the questions. What is your relationship to Chief Leschi?
He would be my great uncle. I'm not sure how many, probably, but uncle.
His sister then?
I'm related through his sister, yeah.
Lisa poses that she's glad to see today there's so many things named for Chief Leschi. There's a street in Olympia named Governor Stevens Street. Reminds me of the statues to Confederate generals in the South. Do you think this street should be renamed? Other folks have also championed that idea. So have you ever heard that posited before, or do you have any thoughts in regard to that, Cynthia?
About having a street named after him,
Yeah, that's, well, or renaming one.
renaming one. I think that would be very much needed.
Okay.
I don't know where, but I think it should be done.
Yeah, this one for Stevens is a possibility. So we'll certainly keep that on the list of possible actions for.
I think that would be really good, especially with since time immemorial is a piece of legislation that is so important to getting this history into the schools. Naming a street after him, I think, would be very good.
Let's see, Stevens Pass is another possibility, I suppose, for renaming.
That would be good.
Let's see, and which sister? Leschi's sister's name.
You know, we never knew her name. We worked and researched so hard to find that, but all the documents, or the very few documents that existed, said her name was unintelligible. So we don't know.
Okay, let's see. We also have with us today two other family members. We do have a recording from Larry Seberg.
Hello, everyone. Doug, in behalf of my Leschi family, I want to thank you and your people for making this day happen. You know, as always, Cynthia, our family will forever be grateful for your ongoing and tireless efforts in keeping grandfather's legacy alive in such a good way, and particularly your leadership in achieving his 2004 exoneration. As you know, that was a big deal, not only for our family, but for Indian country all over. And we only hope that such achievements as yours, that his legacy will continue to become better and better recognized by the outside world for his exceptional leadership and character and overall humanity, rather than to be narrowly defined by his involvement through the unavoidable conflict that was brought about by the attempted unjust government subjugation and colonization, of our people at that dark time in our history. Now, at risk of repetition, I'd like to just briefly elaborate on grandfather's life from a more personal family perspective. You may likely know he was born 217 years ago on January 28, 1808, in the shadow of Mount Tacoma, known today as Mount Rainier. His father was Chief Yanako of the Nisqually Nation. His mother was Cornazita of the Klickitat Nation. It's worth noting that was about the time that the Lewis and Clark expedition finally reached their goal of the Columbia River at the Pacific Ocean. And in my opinion, that was a seminal event that triggered the mass Western migration of settlers to our lands, thus marking the beginning of the end of our people's way of life as they knew it since time immemorial, and ultimately leading to Leschi's tragic ending, February 19th, 1858. It's also worth noting that Leschi was the grandson of the legendary Klickitat Chief Wiowick, who was a patriarch of the spiritual Star Child dynasty in the 18th century, a dynasty that created many great chiefs, including Leschi, throughout the entire Pacific Northwest. It was through that direct lineage that Leschi was gifted with such strong spiritual powers. Namely, he had the Yellow Jacket power that provided him oratory, communication skills, his honesty, his directness. And, basically he was known as a straight shooter, both metamorphically and figuratively. He was an excellent marksman, not only as a hunter, but when needed, as a warrior. He also had the woodpecker power that gave him strength, resolve, and high intelligence. An extraordinary bond also with Mother Nature, Mother Earth, and all she provided to his people. And lastly, and perhaps more importantly, Leschi had the raven power. And that raven power provided him the wisdom and the foresight, his intuition and adaptability, and great tolerance within reason, of course. It was a strong Raven power that enabled him to strategically do so well and to arbitrate disputes. And importantly, it enabled him to cross racial and cultural divides of that time in helping the needy settlers, as well as working closely with Hudson Bay people, therefore being well respected by so many during and after his lifetime. And that concludes my brief thoughts about our grandfather, Leschi. We'll have to finally let history be the judge, I guess. So in closing, I hope that even in some small way, that my words today have captured the essence of Leschi's spirit of tolerance, care and inclusion, and peaceful coexistence, all of which are just so sorely needed in today's deeply troubled world. And I hope Mother Earth would agree with that. So thank you so much for your time. Boy.
Thank you, Larry. And also with us today, his cousin and another great grandson of Leschi is Warren Berg. And Warren, you may share your camera.
Yeah, he's on.
Okay, there we go. Hi, Warren.
Thank you. I am a Leschi descendant, a cousin to Larry Seabird. I joined Larry, my family, and Leschi descendants, living here in across many states. Thank all of you for keeping Leschi's story alive and for this and future generations. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Warren. Cynthia, any other remarks from you before we say adieu?
No, just that I really appreciate everyone being here today and just, ha, lat sebut. It was so good to see all of you people.